I've always had a deep pull toward the Appalachian Mountains, like they were calling me back to some forgotten part of myself. Growing up in a small town just outside Knoxville, Tennessee, I'd spend weekends with my dad trekking those winding trails, learning to read the land. The way the ridges rose like ancient spines against the sky, how the creeks whispered secrets through the valleys. But after he passed a few years back, those hikes became solitary rituals, a way to chase away the noise of city life and feel connected again. That late autumn day in November, I set out for one of the lesser-known paths along the Tennessee-North Carolina border, a rugged stretch called the Overgrown Ridge Trail. It wasn't on most maps, just a faint line locals mentioned in hushed tones at the general store, warning about how it twisted into oblivion if you weren't careful. I packed my backpack heavy, tent, sleeping bag, enough MREs and water for 2 nights, a knife, flashlight, and my old compass that had been Dad's. The air was crisp, carrying the bite of impending winter, and I figured the solitude would do me good after a rough breakup that left me questioning everything. As I pulled into the gravel lot at the trailhead, the sun was already dipping low, painting the trees in shades of amber and rust. The leaves had mostly fallen, carpeting the ground in a brittle mosaic that crunched under my boots like fragile bones. I shouldered my pack and started up, the path narrowing almost immediately, overgrown with briars that tugged at my jeans like insistent fingers. The forest here felt different from the tourist spots, denser, more alive in a way that made your skin prickle. Birds called sporadically, their songs echoing oddly through the fog that was rolling in from the valleys below. I'd heard the stories, of course. Over beers at the bar, old-timers would spin yarns about folks who wandered off these trails and never came back. The mountains take what they want, one grizzled vet had said, his eyes distant. Missing hikers, abandoned campsites stripped clean, attributed to bears or bad weather. But the whispers hinted at something else. Feral people, they called them, descendants of hermits or runaways who'd gone wild, surviving on whatever the woods provided. I laughed it off back then, rationalizing it as folklore to scare outsiders. But as I pushed deeper, that skepticism started to fray. The air grew thicker, almost viscous, laced with the earthy rot of decaying leaves and something sharper, like wet fur. By mid-morning, I'd covered a good 5 miles, sweat beading on my forehead despite the chill. The trail climbed steadily, weaving through stands of hemlock and oak, their branches arching overhead like a skeletal canopy. Fog clung to the underbrush, muting colors and sounds, making the world feel smaller, more intimate, and yet oppressively vast. I stopped for water at a small stream. The trickle over mossy rocks the only noise besides my breathing. That's when the unease settled in, subtle at first, like a shadow lengthening unnoticed. The birds had gone quiet. No rustle of squirrels, no distant snap of twigs from deer. Just the wind sighing through the trees, carrying faint, indistinguishable murmurs. I shook it off, blaming fatigue, and pressed on. Around noon, the path crested a ridge, opening to a small clearing choked with vines and brambles. There, half swallowed by the greenery, stood an old cabin. It looked like it hadn't seen human hands in decades. Boards warped and gray, roof sagging under moss, windows shattered into jagged voids that stared back like empty sockets. Vines crawled up the walls, twisting through cracks, as if the forest was reclaiming it inch by inch. Curiosity tugged at me stronger than caution. I'd seen ruins like this before, remnants of old homesteads from the logging days, but this one felt occupied in a way I couldn't explain. The door hung ajar on rusted hinges, and inside, through the gloom, I glimpsed overturned furniture and scattered debris. I called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" My voice echoed back flat, absorbed by the fog. No answer, but as I stepped closer, a low sound drifted from the trees beyond. A guttural whisper, not quite words, more like a rasp of breath shaped into something almost intelligible. It sent a shiver down my spine, the kind that makes your hairs stand on end. I froze, scanning the underbrush, heart picking up pace. The fog played tricks, turning bushes into shapes, but then I saw it, partially hidden behind a fallen log, a figure. It was human-shaped, but wrong in every detail. Matted hair tangled with twigs and leaves, falling in greasy strands over a face smeared with mud and what looked like dried blood. Dark streaks crusted along the jaw. Its skin was pale beneath the grime, stretched tight over bones, and its eyes. God, those eyes were wild, unblinking, reflecting the dim light like a cornered animal's. It crouched low, body contorted in a way no city dweller would hold, mimicking the shadows as if it had forgotten how to stand upright. My mouth went dry. This wasn't a hiker, not some lost soul. It moved with a feral grace, muscles coiled under ragged clothes that might have once been a shirt and pants, now shredded and patched with hides. I backed away slowly, hands raised, whispering, "Hey, I don't want trouble." But it didn't react like a person would. No shout, no retreat. Instead, it tilted its head, those whispers starting up again, closer now, circling from the trees as if there were more. My mind raced. Was this one of those feral folks the stories warn about? Survivors of some tragedy, driven mad by isolation, living off roots and whatever they could hunt? I turned and walked briskly back to the trail, glancing over my shoulder. It followed, silent footsteps mirroring mine, not charging, just shadowing, keeping pace through the brush. Every time I stopped, it stopped, vanishing into the foliage only to reappear further along. The fog thickened, turning the woods into a labyrinth, and I quickened my step, pulse thundering in my ears. I put miles between us, or so I thought, descending the ridge toward a flatter stretch where I planned to camp. The sun was sinking fast, earlier than it should have in late autumn, casting long shadows that stretched like claws across the path. My legs burned, backpack digging into my shoulders, but I didn't dare stop until I found a small glen by a trickle of water, ringed by dense pines. I set up my tent with shaking hands, the nylon fabric rustling too loudly in the stillness. Dinner was a cold, MRE, beef stew that tasted like cardboard, eaten quickly as darkness enveloped the forest. I crawled inside, zipping the flap tight, flashlight clutched like a talisman. Sleep came in fits, broken by the usual night sounds. Wind in the branches, distant owl calls. But around midnight, the whispers returned. Soft at first, like wind through leaves, but growing distinct. Guttural murmurs circling the tent, just beyond the thin fabric. I sat up, heart slamming, straining to make out words. Was it go or home? Or something older, more primal? I shone the light out the mesh window, beam cutting through the dark, but saw nothing, just endless trees fading into black. The night dragged on, the whispers ebbing and flowing, sometimes joined by faint scratches, like nails on bark. I told myself it was animals, raccoons, maybe drawn by food smells. But deep down I knew better. That figure's eyes haunted me, empty of reason, yet full of intent. Memories flooded in. Dad telling me about the wild man of the hills folks, who fled society during the Depression, intermarrying and devolving into something less than human. The mountains change you, he'd say, half joking. Now, it didn't feel like a joke. I gripped my knife, counting the hours until dawn, every rustle amplifying the dread coiling in my gut. Sleep evaded me, leaving me raw and exhausted as gray light filtered through the canopy. Morning brought a fragile relief. I unzipped the tent, emerging into a world shrouded in mist, the air heavy with dew. But as I packed up, horror gripped me anew. My gear had been rifled through, not torn apart like a bear would do, but methodically searched. Food wrappers scattered, backpack unzipped, half my supplies gone. Energy bars, jerky, even a spare sock. Encircling the campsite, fresh footprints, bare, human-like but distorted, toes splayed wide from years without shoes, imprinted deep in the soft earth. Too small for a full-grown man, too deliberate for coincidence, forming a perfect ring around where I'd slept. No tracks leading in or out, as if they'd appeared from nowhere. Panic surged. I stuffed everything into my pack and bolted down the trail, branches whipping my face, fog blurring the path. Hours blurred into a frantic descent, my mind replaying the whispers, the eyes, the silent pursuit. I burst into the parking lot as the sun broke through, collapsing against my truck, keys fumbling in trembling hands. That was 3 years ago, and I haven't set foot in those mountains since. I moved further west, to flatter lands where the horizon stretches open and unthreatening. But the Appalachians linger in my thoughts, a shadow that never quite fades. In quiet moments, lying awake at night, or walking alone, the wind carries that eerie murmur, faint but insistent, like a call from the ridges. Was it real, or my mind cracking under isolation? The footprints were there, the missing food undeniable. Sometimes I wonder if it was a warning, or an invitation to join whatever lost souls haunt those fog-shrouded woods. The mountains take what they want, and maybe they're not done with me yet. The whispers remind me of that, echoing in the silence, pulling me back to the overgrowth where humanity unravels. The cabin had been in my family for as long as anyone could remember, tucked deep in the hollows of West Virginia, where the mountains folded in on themselves like old, weathered hands. It started as a simple hunting shack built by my great-grandfather back in the coal mining days, when folks scraped a living from the earth and prayed the hills wouldn't swallow them whole. Over the years, it grew a bit, added a porch, a stone fireplace, even a small loft, but it never lost that raw edge, like it was more part of the forest than something man-made. After Mom died last winter, and then the job layoff hit like a gut punch, I needed to get away from the noise of Charleston. The endless honking, the fluorescent lights, the sympathetic stares from friends who didn't know what to say. So I packed my old Ford truck with enough supplies for a week, canned goods, a cooler of beer, my axe for chopping wood, and headed out to the hollow. It was early spring, that tricky time when the world teases you with warmth but clings to the cold, and the drive up those winding roads felt like shedding layers of stress with every mile. The hollow itself was a narrow crease in the landscape, flanked by steep ridges blanketed in oak and hickory, their branches just starting to bud with tentative green. As I bumped down the dirt track that served as a driveway, mist rose from the creek at the bottom, curling through the trees like smoke from a dying fire. It muted everything. The colors faded to grays and soft browns, sounds swallowed up before they could travel far. I parked beside the cabin, the engine ticking as it cooled, and stepped out into air thick with the scent of wet soil and pine. No cell signal out here, of course. That was part of the appeal. Just me, the woods, and whatever ghosts linger in the family stories. Grandpa used to talk about the hollow folk, people who'd vanished into these mountains during hard times. Miners blacklisted after strikes, families fleeing debt, even moonshiners hiding from the law. They don't die out here, he'd say, puffing on his pipe. They just change. I'd always figured it was his way of romanticizing the isolation, but standing there alone, with the mist brushing my skin like cold fingers, those tales felt a little less like fiction. I unlocked the cabin door, the key stiff in the rusted lock, and stepped inside. The place smelled of musty wood and faint smoke from the last fire I'd built months ago. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light filtering through the grimy windows, and the floorboards creaked under my boots like they were protesting my return. I spent the afternoon settling in, airing out the blankets, stocking the pantry shelves, and hauling in firewood from the lean-to out back. By evening, I was out on the porch with the axe, splitting logs from a fallen tree I dragged up the week before. The rhythmic thunk of blade on wood echoed faintly against the ridges, but the mist damped it down, making it feel like I was chopping in a bubble. Sweat soaked my flannel shirt despite the chill, and as the light faded, I paused to wipe my brow, gazing out at the tree line. The hollow narrowed here, the forest pressing close on three sides, with the creek murmuring unseen below. That's when I first noticed the movement, fleeting shadows darting between the trunks, gone before I could focus. Deer, I thought, or maybe wild turkeys scratching for grubs. The mountains were full of life stirring after winter, but a nagging unease settled in my chest, like the air had grown heavier. I shook it off, stacked the wood by the door, and headed inside for supper. Night came on slow, the way it does in the hollows, with dusk lingering in shades of purple and gray. I heated up some beans on the wood stove, cracked a beer, and sat by the fire, the flames crackling softly as they chased away the damp. The cabin's single room felt cozy, almost womb-like, with the loft ladder casting long shadows on the walls. I flipped through an old paperback, some Western Grandpa had left behind, but my mind wandered to the rough year behind me. Mom's slow fade from cancer, the way her hands had looked like bird claws at the end. The layoff notice slipped under my apartment door, impersonal as a utility bill. Out here, those memories didn't sting as sharp. The isolation blunted them, wrapped them in quiet. But as the fire died to embers, the silence outside deepened. No crickets yet this early in spring, no owls hooting. Just the occasional drip from the eaves as mist condensed. I climbed into the loft, burrowing under quilts that smelled of mothballs, and drifted into a fitful sleep, lulled by the cabin's familiar groans. It must have been around midnight when the scratching started. At first, I thought it was a dream, nails dragging across wood, slow and deliberate like someone testing the grain. I bolted upright, heart thudding, the loft pitch black except for the faint glow from the stove below. The sound came from the porch, intermittent, then pausing as if listening. I held my breath, straining my ears. There again, scrape, scrape, not branches in the wind. Too rhythmic, too intentional. Slipping out of bed, I crept to the small window overlooking the front, the floor cold against my bare feet. The mist had thickened into a fog, illuminated faintly by the moon filtering through clouds, turning the yard into a hazy veil. I peered out, wiping condensation from the glass, and that's when I saw them. Two figures, hunched and ragged, standing at the edge of the porch. Their forms were barely distinguishable, silhouettes blurred by the fog, but they weren't animals. Two upright, shoulders rounded like old men bent from labor, but moving with a jerky caution that set my teeth on edge. One was taller, its outline suggesting a tattered coat or hides draped over a gaunt frame. The other squatted lower, hands, or paws, grasping at the air as if sifting through invisible threads. My mouth went dry, a chill spreading from my gut. I told myself it was locals, maybe poachers or drifters drawn by the cabin light. But out here, miles from the nearest road, in this godforsaken hollow, the taller one shifted, turning its head toward the window, and for a split second, the cabin's dim light caught its face, or what passed for one. Filthy hair hung in matted clumps, obscuring features, but beneath it, pale skin gleamed like bone, and eyes. Those eyes reflected the glow with a feral intensity, pupils dilated wide, unblinking. No recognition there, no humanity, just raw, animal watchfulness. It grunted softly, a low rumble that carried through the glass, and the other figure echoed it, their heads tilting in unison. They weren't speaking. It was more like signals, primitive and urgent. I backed away from the window, pulse roaring in my ears, and fumbled for the shotgun propped in the corner. Grandpa's old Remington, loaded with buckshot for bears or whatever else prowled these woods. The scratching resumed, closer now, nails or claws testing the doorframe. I descended the ladder quietly, bare feet silent on the rungs, and approached the door. Through the small pane, I could see them more clearly. The taller one pawing at the latch, fingers gnarled and blackened with dirt, nails chipped like they'd been digging in the earth. Their clothes, if you could call them that, were scraps pieced together from old fabric and animal pelts, stained with mud and what looked like old blood. The smell seeped through the cracks, acrid and wild, like wet dog mixed with decay. They paced the porch, footsteps thudding dully, grunts punctuating the night like muffled coughs. One pressed its face to the window, breath fogging the glass, and I caught a glimpse of teeth, yellowed, uneven, as if filed by years of gnawing bones. Panic clawed at me. I shoved the heavy oak table against the door, wedging it tight, then piled chairs on top for good measure. The cabin had no back exit, just that one door and the windows too small to climb through easily. I retreated to the fireplace, shotgun cradled in my lap, and sat there through the long hours listening. The pacing didn't stop. Back and forth, they went, occasionally stopping to scratch or grunt as if conferring. My mind raced through possibilities. Homeless wanderers? But why here? Why now? Or something worse, survivors from the old mining disasters Grandpa mentioned. The hollow had been dotted with shafts back in the day. Many collapsed in floods or cave-ins, trapping men below. Stories persisted of a few who clawed their way out, only to be changed by the dark, shunning towns and living feral in the hills. They forget how to be people, Grandpa had whispered once, eyes shadowed by firelight. Eat what they catch, sleep in caves, and they don't take kindly to intruders. I dismissed it then, but now, with those shapes lurking just outside, it felt horribly plausible. The mist pressed against the windows like a living thing, amplifying every sound. The creak of boards under their weight, the occasional sniff as if scenting the air. I checked my watch, 2 a.m., then 3, the night stretching endless. Sweat trickled down my back despite the cold, and I gripped the shotgun tighter, finger hovering near the trigger. What if they broke in? Could I shoot? They looked human, almost. Dawn crept in gray and reluctant, the fog lightening to a milky haze. The pacing had stopped some time before first light, the grunts fading into silence. I waited another hour, ears straining, before easing the barricade aside. Shotgun ready, I cracked the door, the hinge squealing like a warning. The porch was empty, mist swirling lazily, but marks scarred the wood. Deep gouges from nails or tools, splintered in places. Footprints dotted the damp earth. Bare, human-shaped but splayed wide, toes elongated from years without shoes. They led toward the tree line, vanishing into the underbrush. Relief washed over me, shaky and incomplete. I stepped out, scanning the yard, and that's when I saw the truck. All 4 tires slashed, deep gashes weeping air, the cuts crude and jagged, as if made with dull stones or bones rather than a knife. My stomach dropped. This wasn't random. It was deliberate, a message or a trap to keep me here longer. The spares were in the bed, thankfully untouched, but changing them would take time, exposed out here. Hands trembling, I worked quickly, jacking up the truck 1 wheel at a time, the mist clinging to my clothes like sweat. Every rustle in the bushes made me jump, eyes darting to the trees where shadows lingered too long. Were they watching? Waiting for me to falter? The hollow felt alive with unseen eyes, the ridges looming like judgmental sentinels. As I tightened the last lug nut, a low grunt echoed from the creek below, distant but unmistakable. I threw my gear into the cab, started the engine with a roar that shattered the quiet, and peeled out down the track, tires spinning on mud. The cabin receded in the rear view, swallowed by fog, but the unease followed me all the way to the highway. That was over a year ago, and I haven't been back. The cabin sits empty now, deeds still in my name, but I can't bring myself to sell it or return. The hollow feels tainted, a place where the line between man and wilderness blurs, where isolation frays the edges of humanity until what's left is something raw and unrecognizable. I dream of those figures sometimes, their feral eyes gleaming in the dark, grunts turning to whispers that sound almost like names. Maybe, or warnings. In the quiet of my apartment, when the city noise fades, I swear I hear scratching at the door, faint but persistent. The mountains remember, and they don't let go easily. What if they're still out there, waiting for the next lost soul to wander into their domain? What if part of me is still trapped in that mist, unraveling? Caving has always been my escape, a way to slip away from the chaos of everyday life and immerse myself in the quiet underbelly of the world. Growing up in rural Kentucky, not far from the sprawling network of Mammoth Cave, I got hooked early. My uncle was a park ranger there, and he'd take me on guided tours as a kid, pointing out the glittering formations and telling stories of explorers who got lost in the labyrinthine passages. But it was the unmarked systems that called to me most, the ones off the maps, hidden in the folds of the Appalachian hills where limestone had been carving secrets for millennia. I'd mapped dozens over the years, sketching crude diagrams in my notebook, marking squeezes and drops with notes on rope lengths and air quality. It wasn't just the thrill, it was the silence, the way the earth swallowed sound and light, leaving you alone with your thoughts. After a messy divorce that left me rattling around an empty house in Lexington, I needed that more than ever. So one sweltering summer afternoon in July, I loaded up my Jeep with gear, headlamp, helmet, coils of rope, harness, a first aid kit, energy bars, and water, and headed west toward the backcountry near Mammoth. The unmarked entrance I'd heard about from an old forum post was supposed to be a virgin system, untouched by tourists, maybe even by locals. I parked off a gravel road, shouldered my pack, and hiked through dense underbrush, the humidity clinging to my skin like a second layer. The entrance was subtle, just a narrow fissure in a rocky outcrop, half hidden by ferns and fallen leaves. I squeezed through, the cool air rushing up to greet me like a sigh from the depths. Immediately, the world above faded, the bird calls, the rustle of wind in the trees, replaced by the drip-drip of water echoing off walls I couldn't yet see. I flicked on my headlamp, the beam cutting a narrow path through the blackness, illuminating slick limestone streaked with minerals that shimmered like veins of quartz. The passage sloped downward gently at first, wide enough to walk upright, but soon it narrowed, forcing me to stoop. My boots scraped against the uneven floor, pebbles skittering away into voids. I've been in caves like this before, but something about this one felt different from the start. The air was heavier, laced with a faint, musty odor. Not just the usual damp earth, but something organic, like rotting vegetation or unwashed bodies. I shook it off, attributing it to the heat outside, contrasting with the constant 54 degrees below. My breath came in steady puffs, visible in the beam, and I focused on the rhythm. Step, breathe, scan. I rigged a short drop with my rope, about 20 feet into a wider chamber, and rappelled down smoothly, the harness creaking softly. Landing on a bed of loose scree, I uncoiled the rope and pressed on, the walls closing in again, forcing me to crawl on hands and knees through a tight squeeze. The rock pressed against my back and chest, cold and unyielding, and for a moment claustrophobia nipped at the edges of my mind. But I pushed through, emerging into a taller passage where I could stand. Deeper in, the cave opened up into a series of interconnected rooms, stalactites hanging like frozen rain from the ceiling, their tips glistening with moisture. Water pooled in shallow depressions, reflecting my light back at me in fractured mirrors. I've been underground for maybe an hour, mapping as I went, noting a side passage that branched left, sketching the flowstone formations that looked like melted wax. The silence was profound, broken only by my movements and the occasional plink of a water drop. That's when I first noticed the anomalies. In a small alcove off the main path, my beam caught the glint of metal. Rusted cans, scattered haphazardly, their labels long faded but shapes suggesting soup or beans from decades ago. Nearby, tattered scraps of cloth clung to the rock, frayed and moldy, as if torn from old shirts or blankets. This didn't match any known history. The area around Mammoth had been explored extensively, but these looked recent, not artifacts from 19th century miners. I knelt to examine them, my gloved hand brushing dust away. No footprints, no fresh disturbance, but a chill crept up my spine. Who would leave this here? Squatters? Lost hikers who'd taken shelter? The forum post hadn't mentioned any activity, but caves like this could hide anything. I snapped a few photos with my phone, signal long gone, but for documentation, and moved on, the unease lingering like the damp on my skin. The passage twisted downward, the air growing cooler and thicker, pressing in with that same odd scent. I navigated a series of boulder chokes, climbing over and under massive rocks that had tumbled from the ceiling eons ago. My headlamp beam danced across the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to shift just beyond my periphery. Fatigue was setting in, sweat mixing with cave mud on my face, but the thrill kept me going. Then, faint but unmistakable, an echo drifted up from ahead, what sounded like muffled voices, distorted by the stone, bouncing off the irregular surfaces. I froze, heart skipping a beat. Other spelunkers? It wasn't impossible. These systems interconnected in ways maps couldn't capture. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing back at me, warped and lonely. The response wasn't what I expected, a series of guttural clicks and hisses, not quite language, more like animal sounds filtered through human throats. It came from deeper in, reverberating through the passages like a whisper from the earth itself. Adrenaline surged. I told myself it was bats or wind through cracks, but curiosity overrode caution. I pressed on, the path narrowing again, forcing me to sidle through a slit in the rock, my pack scraping against the walls. The chamber opened suddenly, a vast room where my light couldn't reach the far walls. Formations rose from the floor like silent sentinels, and the air hung heavy, almost stagnant. I swept the beam around, and that's when it caught them. Figures huddled in the shadows, clustered against a far wall. At first, I thought they were rock piles or illusions of light, but as I focused, details emerged. Emaciated bodies, skin pallid and stretched tight over bones, like they hadn't seen sun in years. They were clothed in rags, pieced together scraps of animal hides and faded fabric, mottled with grime and cave dust. There were maybe 4 or 5, crouched low, their postures feral, heads bowed, but eyes lifting toward my light. Wide, unblinking eyes that reflected the beam with a glassy hunger, pupils dilated in the perpetual dark. They didn't move aggressively, no snarls or charges. Just watched, bodies tense, as if I'd intruded on a sacred space. One, closer than the others, shifted slightly. A woman, maybe though it was hard to tell through the matted hair that fell like a veil over her face. She reached out a trembling hand, fingers gnarled like tree roots, nails broken and blackened, palm up in a gesture that could have been begging or warning. My breath caught, mind reeling. These weren't explorers. They looked like they'd been born down here, adapted to the void. Descendants of runaways, perhaps, slaves fleeing north via the Underground Railroad, or miners trapped in collapses who'd clawed their way into side systems and never left. Stories I dismissed as legend. Cave dwellers, feral families surviving on blind fish and fungi, their humanity eroded by generations in the dark. The click started again, soft and rhythmic, passing between them like a language I'd interrupted. Fear hit me like a cold wave. I backed away slowly, beam steady on them, heart pounding against my ribs. The one with the outstretched hand inched forward, her movements jerky, unpracticed, as if walking upright was a forgotten skill. I turned and bolted, scrambling back through the slit, rocks tearing at my clothes, pack banging against the walls. Echoes of my flight bounced around me, mingled with their hisses, growing fainter but pursuing. I squeezed through the narrow passages, lungs burning, the rope drop a blur as I ascended hand over hand, muscles screaming. Daylight pierced the entrance like a lifeline, and I burst out, collapsing onto the ferns, gasping for air that tasted sweet and alive. Hours passed before I could move, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows through the trees. My body ached from scrapes and bruises, but as I inventoried my pack by the jeep, dread returned. Items were missing, energy bars gone, a spare flashlight vanished, even my multi-tool absent. Not lost in the scramble, taken silently, perhaps while I fled, by hands that knew the dark better than I ever could. I drove out that evening, the hills receding in the mirror, but the memory clung. Those eyes, that hand, reaching not in threat, but in some desperate plea. I seal my maps now, burn the sketches, tell no one. But in quiet nights, when sleep evades me, I hear the echoes, clicks and hisses filtering through dreams, calling from depths that swallow light and lives. What they're surfacing, drawn by the world above. What secrets do those caves still hold, waiting to crawl out into the sun? The Appalachians keep their own, and sometimes they don't let go. Climbing had become my way of reclaiming control after everything fell apart. I'd lost my job in Raleigh to some corporate merger, the kind where they send you packing with a severance check and a pat on the back, like that makes up for years of grinding away in a cubicle. My marriage crumbled right after, my wife citing the distance that had grown between us, though I knew it was more about the late nights I'd spent staring at screens instead of her. So I turned to the mountains, the remote peaks of North Carolina's Appalachians, where the world narrowed to just you, the trail, and whatever strength you had left. This particular summit, Black Balsam Knob or something like it, though I'd veered off the main paths on unmarked routes, was supposed to be my solo challenge. No guides, no partners, just me testing limits against the rugged terrain. I packed light, backpack with a tent, sleeping bag, water filter, energy bars, a knife, compass, and a worn map I'd annotated from online forums. The drive from the city took hours, winding through valleys where cell service dropped like a stone, and by the time I hit the trailhead at dawn, the air was crisp with pine and the faint sweetness of morning dew clinging to ferns. The trail started easy enough, a gentle incline through dense forests of rhododendron and hemlock, their branches interlacing overhead like a green cathedral. Sunlight dappled the path, birds flitting between trees with cheerful calls that echoed softly. I breathed deep, feeling the burn in my legs as I ascended, each step shedding a layer of the city's weight. I'd hiked these mountains before, but always on popular routes with day trippers and families. This time, I wanted isolation, the kind where hours pass without another soul, with the only sounds of your boots on dirt and the wind sighing through leaves. Locals in the nearby town had warned me about going solo. "Them hills got eyes," an old man at the gas station had muttered, his tobacco-stained teeth flashing in a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Stories of hikers vanishing, gear found scattered, but no bodies. I laughed it off as small-town folklore, the same way they'd spin yarns about moonshiners or Civil War ghosts. But as the path steepened, twisting around boulders and over root-choked ground, a subtle shift settled in. The birds quieted, replaced by the rustle of leaves underfoot, and the air grew heavier, carrying the earthy scent of moss and something sharper, like distant smoke. By mid-morning, the fog rolled in. It started as wisps curling from the valleys below, but soon thickened, reducing visibility to arm's length. The world shrank to a hazy bubble around me, trees materializing like phantoms, then vanishing behind. I relied on my compass, the needle steady north, and paced myself, sweat beading under my jacket despite the chill seeping through. The trail climbed relentlessly now, switchbacks cutting through laurel thickets that grabbed at my pants like insistent hands. My breath came in rhythmic puffs, visible in the mist, and I stopped occasionally to sip water, listening to the silence that pressed in. No wildlife sounds, no distant echoes of other hikers. Just the soft drip of condensation from branches overhead. Memories crept in during those pauses. My ex-wife's voice on the phone, clipped and final. The empty office I'd cleared out, boxes of meaningless papers. Up here, those felt distant, but the isolation amplified a nagging doubt. What if I twisted an ankle, slipped on wet rock? The mountains didn't care. They just endured, indifferent to fools like me. Hours blurred as I pushed higher, the air thinning, my legs aching with the effort. The fog enveloped everything, turning the forest into a monochromatic dreamscape where shapes loomed and dissolved. I crested what felt like the final ridge, emerging onto a plateau dotted with massive boulders, their surfaces slick with moisture. Grass tufted between them, bent by wind, and the ground leveled out, offering a brief respite. I dropped my pack against a rock, rolling my shoulders, and scanned the haze for the summit marker, a cairn or signpost I'd read about online. Nothing visible, just endless gray. The quiet was profound here, almost oppressive, broken only by my own breathing. I sat on a boulder, unwrapping an energy bar, the crinkle of foil unnaturally loud. That's when I sensed it, not alone. Subtle rustles, like bare feet padding over leaves, circled the plateau's edge. I froze, bar halfway to my mouth, ears straining. Wind? Animals foraging? But it was too patterned, too encircling, as if whatever made it was pacing just beyond sight. Unease prickled my skin, raising goosebumps under my layers. I called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" My voice fell flat, absorbed by the fog without echo. No response, but the rustles paused, then resumed, closer now. I stood slowly, knife in hand, not that it would do much good, and peered into the mist. A silhouette flickered through the haze. A human shape, crouched low against a boulder, motionless as a statue carved from the rock itself. My heart stuttered. Was it a hiker? Lost like me? But as the fog shifted briefly, details emerged. Long, unkempt hair matted with leaves and dirt, hanging in tangles over a face smeared with what looked like clay or mud for camouflage. The body was lean, wiry, clothed in rags that blended with the earth tones, scraps of fabric and hides pieced together haphazardly. It didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence, just huddled there, eyes fixed on me from hollow sockets, piercing through the gloom. Panic flickered, but I tamped it down, rationalizing. Maybe a homeless person squatting up here to avoid society. The Appalachians were riddled with such tales. People fleeing debts, wars, or just the crush of modern life, vanishing into the wild until they became part of it. "Hey, you okay?" I shouted again, voice cracking slightly. Still nothing. But then, more shapes materialized in the periphery, emerging from the fog like ghosts solidifying. 3, 4, encircling the clearing, their breathing ragged and synchronized, a low rasp that carried on the damp air. They mirrored the first. Feral postures, bodies adapted to the terrain, skin pale beneath the grime, eyes hollow yet alert, watching with an intensity that felt both curious and predatory. No weapons visible, no aggressive moves, but their presence screamed intrusion. I backed toward my pack, knife gripped tight, mind racing. Were these the wild ones the old-timers whispered about? Descendants of settlers who'd gone native, intermarrying with the land until civilization was a forgotten dream? Their synchronized breaths rose and fell like a pack's, and one shifted slightly, head tilting as if assessing prey. The fog closed in again, blurring their forms, but I felt their eyes on me, unblinking. My mouth went dry, adrenaline surging as I shouldered my pack. "I'm leaving," I muttered, more to myself, and started descending the way I'd come, steps quick but measured to avoid slipping. The rustles followed, subtle at first, branches snapping in pursuit, always just out of sight. I glanced back, catching glimpses, a shadow darting between boulders, another paralleling my path through the laurels. They didn't close in, didn't call out, but their presence shadowed me like a weight, turning the descent into a nightmare of paranoia. The trail twisted downward, fog thickening in the lower elevations, and every misstep sent rocks clattering, echoing my fear. Hours stretched. My legs burned, lungs heaving, but I didn't stop. Memories flooded in, childhood stories from my grandfather, a veteran who'd hiked these peaks after Korea. The mountains got guardians, he'd say, voice gravelly from cigarettes. Silent types, watching from the high places. You respect them, or they remind you who's boss. I'd thought it metaphor, but now, with snaps and rustles dogging my heels, it felt literal. Base camp came into view as dusk crept in, a small clearing where I'd pitched my tent that morning before the ascent. The fog lingered here, too, muting the colors, but the tent stood undisturbed, zipper flap secure. Relief hit me like a wave. I collapsed beside it, gulping water, scanning the tree line for movement. Nothing visible, the rustles faded. But as I caught my breath, something caught my eye. A ring of stones encircling the site, piled deliberately around the perimeter. They hadn't been there when I left. Smooth river rocks stacked 3 high, etched with crude symbols, spirals, crosses, marks that looked like claws or runes. My stomach twisted. This wasn't natural, not animal work. Human hands had done this. Warning? Claim? I traced one with my finger, the carving rough, as if made with a dull stone. Were they marking territory or warding me off? The silent watchers from the summit. Had they descended ahead, leaving this message while I fled? Night fell fully as I broke camp, stuffing gear haphazardly, the stone's presence urging haste. The drive out was a blur of headlights, piercing fog, roads twisting like veins through the dark. I made it home by midnight, locking doors, drawing curtains, but sleep brought no peace. Dreams replayed the plateau, shapes encircling, breaths syncing with mine, eyes piercing the mist. I'd wake sweating, heart racing, convinced of rustles outside my window. That was 2 years ago, and the summit haunts me still, a realm where man and wild blur into something profoundly unsettling, where silence speaks louder than screams. I avoid high places now, sticking to flatlands, but the mountains call in quiet moments, their foggy peaks whispering through memories. What if those guardians followed me down, patient and unseen? What if the ring of stones was an invitation, not a barrier? The Appalachians hold their secrets close, and sometimes they reach out, pulling you back into the haze. Fishing had always been my sanctuary, a ritual that pulled me away from the grind of everyday life and into the quiet rhythm of nature. Living in Roanoke, Virginia, with a desk job that chained me to spreadsheets and endless meetings, I craved those weekends where I could disappear into the Appalachian Range. The Shenandoah River, with its remote bends and hidden eddies, was my favorite haunt. I've been going there since I was a kid, tagging along with my father, who taught me how to read the water, the way eddies swirled around submerged rocks, how trout hid in the shadows of overhanging branches. After he passed from heart attack a couple years back, those trips became more solitary, more necessary. They were my way of keeping him close, of silencing the worries that piled up, bills stacking higher, a relationship that had fizzled out without fanfare, the nagging sense that life was slipping by unnoticed. One crisp fall morning in October, with leaves turning shades of fire and gold, I loaded my old pickup with my rod, tackle box, a cooler of sandwiches and beer, and headed north into the mountains. The air was sharp, carrying the promise of frost, and I figured a day by the river would wash away the week's residue. The drive took about an hour, winding through valleys where mist clung to the hollows like reluctant ghosts. I parked at a pull-off near a trailhead few knew about, not marked on tourist maps, just a faint path locals whispered about over coffee at the diner. Shouldering my gear, I hiked in, the trail meandering through dense stands of oak and maple, their leaves crunching underfoot like brittle paper. The mountains towered around me, silent sentinels of weathered rock and ancient forest, their peaks lost in low clouds. Birds called sporadically, a crow's caw echoing off the ridges, but as I descended toward the river, the sound softened, muffled by the thickening foliage. The Shenandoah appeared gradually, its waters a gentle murmur at first, then a steady flow glinting in the dappled light. I followed a game trail to my secluded bend, a natural pool where the river curved sharply, flanked by steep banks and reeds that swayed like whispers. It was pristine, untouched by the weekend crowds that flocked to the popular spots downstream. No beer cans littering the shore, no charred fire rings. Just the river's soothing cadence, the occasional splash of a fish breaking surface, and the earthy scent of mud and decaying leaves. I set up on a flat rock overhanging the water, baiting my hook with a worm from my bucket, the soil still damp from the garden back home. Casting the line, I watched it arc gracefully, plopping into the current with a soft ripple. The rod settled in my hands, familiar as an old friend, and I leaned back, letting the tension ease from my shoulders. The sun climbed slowly, burning off the morning chill, warming my flannel shirt. For a while, it was perfect. The gentle tug of the line, the play of light on the water, memories of Dad surfacing like the trout I hoped to catch. He'd always say the river had its own language, one you had to listen to patiently. But as I reeled in an empty hook and rebaited, my eyes wandered to the mud along the bank. Something odd caught my attention. Prints pressed deep into the soft earth where the water met the shore. They looked human-like, bare feet, toes splayed wide, but elongated, calloused ridges where heels and balls should be smooth. They trailed from the dense woods upstream, meandering to the water's edge before vanishing into the shallows. Not fresh, maybe from the day before, but deliberate, like someone had waited in purposefully. A chill prickled my neck despite the sun. Hikers? But who went barefoot out here, especially with the rocks sharp as knives underfoot? I scanned the opposite bank, a tangle of reeds and willows backed by rising forest, but saw nothing unusual. Shrugging it off, probably some eccentric local or a kid messing around, I cast again, focusing on the bobber drifting lazily. Yet the unease lingered, a subtle itch at the back of my mind. The river's flow seemed louder now, or maybe the woods quieter. No more bird calls, just the wind rustling leaves high above. I caught a small brook trout after a bit, its scales iridescent as I unhooked it gently and released it back, watching it dart away. Satisfaction warmed me, but as I sat there, rod in hand, the feeling grew, eyes on me. Not imagined, not paranoia from too much solitude. It was that primal sense, the one that raises hairs on your arms, telling you you're being watched. I glanced around casually, pretending to adjust my line, but the bend felt exposed suddenly, the mountains pressing in like watchful giants. Across the river, partially concealed by the reeds, a figure stood. At first, I thought it was a trick of light and shadow, a stump or a deer frozen mid-step. But as I stared, details sharpened. Gaunt frame, clad in scraps of fabric and fur that hung like molted skin, hair matted into dreads that blended seamlessly with the overhanging branches. It mirrored my stillness, hunched slightly, one hand resting on a willow trunk. The face was obscured, but I felt its gaze, intense, unblinking, a mix of predatory focus and raw curiosity, like a wild animal encountering something new. My heart quickened, breath shallow. Was it a vagrant? Someone lost or hurt? The Appalachians had their share of hermits, folks who dropped off the grid, living rough in the hills. Dad had stories from his hunting days, sightings of river people, remnants of old families who'd shunned society after the mines closed or the floods came, surviving on what the land gave. They ain't right, he'd say, voice low. Years out here, twist a man. I called out, hey, you okay over there? My voice carried across the water, flat and intrusive, but the figure didn't flinch, didn't respond. Just watched, body tense as a coiled spring. The sun climbed higher, warming the air, but the chill in my gut deepened. I tried to ignore it, casting again, but my hand shook slightly, the line tangling once. The figure remained, a sentinel in the reeds, its presence turning the peaceful bend into something oppressive. Then, as if summoned, more shapes materialized beside it. 3 or 4, emerging from the underbrush with eerie unison. They moved silently, wading into the shallows without a splash, their forms mirroring the first. Emaciated, skins etched with scars from thorns and rocks, clothes pieced from hides and faded cloth. Hair wild, eyes hollow under brows heavy with dirt. They didn't speak, didn't gesture wildly, just advanced slowly, the water parting around their legs like they were part of the current. Panic bubbled up. This wasn't curiosity anymore. Their movements were coordinated like a pack, closing in, breaths sinking in low, almost inaudible rasps. I reeled in hastily, line whipping through the guides, and backed away from the rock, grabbing my tackle box. Stay back, I shouted, voice cracking, but they kept coming, the lead one now mid-river, water lapping at its knees. One crossed swiftly then, faster than the others, lunging toward my side with a grace that belied its ragged appearance. It grabbed at my bait bucket, dirt-encrusted hands snatching the handle, nails broken and jagged like they clawed through earth for years. Up close, the smell hit me, rank like wet fur and unwashed flesh, mingled with the river's mud. Its skin was a map of survival. Cuts healed into white lines, bruises faded to yellow, eyes meeting mine for a split second. Wild, desperate, devoid of the spark that makes us human. A low moan escaped its throat, not a growl, but a lament, echoing from the others like a chorus. I yanked the bucket back, worms spilling into the mud, and bolted, leaving rod and cooler behind. Branches whipped my face as I crashed up the trail, lungs burning, feet pounding the earth. Their moans followed, fading but persistent, weaving through the trees like the river's whisper. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I hit the truck, keys fumbling in my pocket, engine roaring to life as I peeled out, gravel spraying. That afternoon blurred into shock, driving home shaking, replaying the encounter until it felt surreal. But the scrapes on my arms were real, the mud on my boots tangible. I called the Rangers the next day, voice steady as I could manage, reporting what I'd seen. Possible vagrants, aggressive, I said, downplaying the feral edge to avoid sounding crazy. 2 officers met me at the trailhead the following morning, sturdy guys in khaki with sidearms and radios. We hiked in together, the path familiar yet tainted now, the mountains looming with a new menace. The bend looked undisturbed at first, the river flowing as always, my abandoned rod leaning against the rock where I dropped it. But as we approached the bank, the footprints were gone, washed away or covered. The Rangers scanned the opposite shore, binoculars raised, but saw nothing in the reeds. Could have been transients, one muttered, poking at the mud with a stick. Then he froze, unearthing something pale and curved. A bone, human perhaps, picked clean and weathered. More scattered nearby. Ribs, a femur fragment, half buried in the silt. Not fresh, but not ancient either. Animals could have dragged him here, the other said, but his tone lacked conviction. They bagged what they found, promised to investigate, but I saw the doubt in their eyes. These mountains swallowed secrets daily. We left without answers. The Rangers chatting about poachers or old graves disturbed by floods. But I knew better. Those figures weren't transients. They were remnants, feral echoes of forgotten lives. Maybe descendants of moonshiners or miners who'd fled into the wild, adapting until the river claimed them as its own. They guarded their waters jealously, watching from the shadows, emerging only when intruders lingered too long. I fish lakes now, far from those whispering currents, sticking to crowded spots where laughter drowns the silence. But the Shenandoah lingers in my thoughts, its bends haunting dreams where moans rise from the reeds, hands reaching with scarred fingers. What if those bones were warnings, markers of others who'd strayed too close? What if they're still there, waiting patiently for the next soul to cast a line into their domain? The mountains remember, and sometimes, in the quiet flow of a stream, I hear their lament calling me back. The orchard had been my grandfather's pride, a sprawling patch of apple trees he'd planted himself back in the 1940s on the family land in Pennsylvania's Appalachian foothills. It sat in a remote valley near the Allegheny Plateau, where the hills rolled like frozen waves, isolating the property from the nearest town by miles of winding, unpaved roads. As kids, my sister and I would spend summers there, picking fruit under his watchful eye, the air sweet with ripening apples and his stories of the land's history. How it had once been part of a larger farm, worked by migrant laborers during the harvests, some of whom vanished into the woods when times got hard. The mountains take care of their own, he'd say with a wink, but there was always a shadow in his eyes, like he knew more than he let on. After he passed away last fall from a stroke that came sudden and quiet in his sleep, the place fell to me. My sister wanted nothing to do with it, living out in California with her busy life, so I took it on, figuring I'd clean it up and maybe sell. But deep down, it was a pull back to childhood memories, a chance to say goodbye properly. That winter, with snow blanketing the Northeast, I drove up alone, the heater in my old Subaru struggling against the biting cold, arriving just as dusk settled over the valley like a heavy quilt. The farmhouse loomed at the end of the drive, a 2-story structure of weather clapboard, its paint peeling like old skin. Snow dusted the roof and the twisted branches of the orchard beyond, turning the scene into something out of a faded postcard. Beautiful, but desolate. I parked and stepped out, the crunch of my boots on the frozen ground echoing too loudly in the still air. No wind stirred, no birds called, just that profound quiet the mountains wrap around you, making your thoughts feel exposed. I unlocked the door with the key from under the mat, Grandpa's old habit, and stepped inside. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of dust and faint wood smoke from the cold fireplace. Furniture sat where it always had. The sagging couch, the kitchen table scarred from years of meals, his rocking chair by the window overlooking the orchard. I dropped my duffel bag and started a fire in the hearth, the flames crackling to life and casting flickering shadows on the walls. Upstairs, his bedroom was untouched, bed made neatly, a Bible on the nightstand. I felt his absence like a weight, memories flooding in, him teaching me to prune trees, his rough hands guiding mine, warning about the wild parts of the property where the orchard met the denser woods. "Don't wander too far," he'd say. "Things get lost out there." I shook it off, blaming the isolation, and unpacked canned soup, bread, a lantern for when the generator failed, and my axe for clearing paths. Tomorrow, I'd start work. Morning broke gray and cold, the sky low with clouds promising more snow. After coffee boiled on the wood stove, I bundled up in layers, wool coat, gloves, boots, and headed into the orchard. The trees stood like skeletal guardians, branches gnarled and overgrown, heavy with neglect. Vines choked the trunks, and fallen apples from the previous season lay rotting under a thin layer of snow, their fermenting smell mixing with the crisp winter air. I swung the axe at underbrush, clearing a path between rows, the rhythmic thuds echoing faintly against the hills. Sweat built under my clothes despite the chill, and I paused often, breath fogging the air, to listen to the silence. It wasn't complete quiet. There was the distant drip of melting icicles, the occasional creak of branches settling under snow. But something felt off, like the land was holding its breath. As I pushed deeper, toward the back where the orchard faded into wilder terrain, I uncovered old tools half buried in the weeds. A rusted pruning saw, a hoe bent from use, relics from Grandpa's era. They stirred nostalgia, but then I spotted fresher signs. Gnawed fruit cores scattered near a cluster of trees. Not animal bites, too precise, with teeth marks that looked human, the flesh stripped clean. Nearby, a makeshift shelter huddled against a trunk. Branches lashed together with vines, lined with dried leaves and what looked like scraps of old burlap. My stomach tightened. Squatters? Hunters taking shelter? The valley was remote, but not impossible for drifters. I poked at the shelter with my axe, finding nothing inside but a faint, musky odor like unwashed bodies in damp earth. Unease prickled my skin, but I rationalized it. Maybe locals scavenging or animals smarter than I gave credit. I cleared more, hauling debris to a burn pile, the work numbing my thoughts until dusk crept in, shortening the day. Back in the farmhouse, I heated soup on the stove, the steam rising in lazy curls, and ate by the fire, the flames popping softly. The windows frosted over as night deepened, turning the outside world into a blurred void. I read one of Grandpa's old books, a worn almanac filled with notes in his handwriting about planting cycles and weather patterns. But my mind wandered to the signs in the orchard. Memories surfaced, summers when we'd hear distant cries at night, which he'd dismiss as foxes or owls. Nature's symphony, he'd call it, but I'd catch him staring out the window, face tight. Exhaustion pulled me upstairs early, the bed cold under heavy quilts. Sleep came fitful, the house creaking in the wind that had picked up, snow tapping against the panes like insistent fingers. Around midnight, the cries started. Not animal howls, but human wails, raw, despairing, drifting from the orchard like echoes from a forgotten grave. They rose and fell, muffled by the snow but piercing the night, carrying a sorrow that twisted my gut. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to listen. Was it the wind? Neighbors miles away? But no, these were voices, multiple, overlapping in a mournful chorus, not words but pure emotion, like grief given sound. I couldn't ignore it, slipping on boots and coat over my thermals. I grabbed the lantern from the kitchen, its kerosene flame hissing to life. The beam cut through the dark as I stepped onto the porch, snow crunching underfoot, the cold biting at my face like needles. The orchard stretched before me, a maze of twisted shadows under a sliver of moon. The cries louder now, pulling me forward. I followed them, lantern held high, the light dancing over snow-dusted ground, revealing my earlier paths, already filling with fresh flakes. The air was still again, the wind gone, making the wails seem closer, more intimate. Branches snagged my coat as I ventured deeper, toward the thicket at the orchard's edge where the trees gave way to denser woods. My breath came in short puffs, visible in the glow, and doubt nagged. Should I turn back? Call someone? But the isolation mocked me. No signal, no neighbors. The cries intensified, guiding me to a cluster of overgrown bushes, their forms hulking in the night. There, in the lantern's unsteady light, figures lurked, pale, disheveled people, 3 or 4, huddled in the shadows. Their clothes were threadbare, layers of scavenged hides and rags draped over gaunt frames, bodies adapted to the cold with makeshift insulation that looked pieced from animal pelts and old blankets. Skin sallow, faces obscured by wild hair and beards matted with ice, eyes reflecting the light with a desperate gleam. They didn't speak. Instead, they gestured wildly, arms waving slowly, hands clawing at the air, expressions twisted in what could be pleading or threat. I couldn't tell. One, an older man perhaps, stepped forward, his breath fogging the air in ragged bursts, face weathered like bark cracked by frost. His eyes locked on mine, hollow yet alive with some unspoken need, and he reached out, fingers trembling, touching the sleeve of my coat as if remembering the feel of fabric from a life long abandoned. Up close, the smell hit me, sour like sweat and earth baked into skin, mingled with the rot of the orchard. Fear gripped me, a cold vice around my chest. These weren't intruders, not in the usual sense. They looked like relics, descendants maybe of those migrant workers Grandpa mentioned, families who'd come for harvest and stayed, lost to the land's isolation, surviving on what the mountains provided until generations blur the line between human and wild. The one touching me moaned softly, a sound that vibrated through my bones, and the others echoed it, their gestures growing insistent, circling closer. Panic surged. I backed away, lanterns swinging wildly, shadows leaping like accusations. "What do you want?" I whispered, voice hoarse, but they only wailed louder, trailing me as I retreated through the trees. Branches snapped under their bare feet, calloused, frostbitten but unyielding, their forms melting into the dark only to reappear at the edges of my light. I stumbled back to the farmhouse, heart slamming the door and bolting it, leaning against the wood as their cries faded into the night. The fire had died to embers, the room cold, and I spent the hours until dawn huddled in the rocking chair, lantern burning low, jumping at every creak. Sleep evaded me, mind racing through possibilities. Hallucinations from grief? Real people, driven mad by hunger and cold? Grandpa's stories replayed. Workers who'd vanished during the Depression, rumors of hidden camps in the hills where folks lived off the grid, intermarrying and forgetting the world. The mountains swallow souls whole, he'd say, and now it felt prophetic. Dawn came pale and unforgiving. The snow stopped, leaving the world muffled and pristine. I ventured out cautiously, axe in hand, but the orchard was silent, no tracks visible under the fresh powder, as if the night had erased itself. Back inside, warming by a new fire, I noticed the windows, smudged handprints on the glass, fingers splayed in silent appeal, too many for one person, pressed from outside during the dark hours. My skin crawled. They'd been here, watching, reaching. I packed that morning, loading the car with what little I brought, and drove out without looking back. The property sold quickly to some developer from the city, eager for the land despite its remoteness. I told myself it was over, but those haunting echoes linger, surfacing in quiet moments. The wails in my dreams, the touch on my coat like a claim. Were they begging for help or warning me away? Descendants lost to isolation or something the mountains birthed themselves. I avoid orchards now, stick to city lights, but the Appalachians whisper in the wind, reminding me how easily souls unravel in their grasp. What if they're still out there, crying for the next wanderer? What if part of me stayed behind, swallowed whole? Hunting had been my way of connecting to the land ever since I was a boy, growing up in the shadow of Ohio's Appalachian hills where the forests swallowed whole towns and spit out their bones. My father was a coal miner before the unions broke and the seams ran dry, and he'd take me out during deer season, teaching me to track through the underbrush to listen for the snap of twigs that meant game nearby. After he died in a cave-in at one of the last operating shafts, official reports said structural failure, but whispers among the old-timers hinted at corners cut for profit. I inherited his rifle and his love for the hunt. It became my ritual, a way to feel him close amid the rustling leaves and crisp autumn air. But the hills changed after the mines closed. Towns emptied, leaving behind skeletons of buildings and pitted earth like war scars. I knew the risks, sinkholes that could swallow a man whole, toxic runoff, poisoning streams. But the pull was stronger than caution. That November, with deer season in full swing, I set out alone for the forgotten ruins near Hocking County, where abandoned shafts dotted the ridges like open wounds. I packed my truck with the essentials: Remington 700 bolted action, ammo, a day pack with water, jerky, a knife, and my old compass. The drive from Columbus took a couple hours, roads narrowing from highway to gravel, then to rutted tracks that tested the suspension. By the time I parked at the edge of the old mining road, barred by faded, no trespassing signs chained across, the sun was climbing, painting the forest in shades of gold and rust. I shouldered my gear and slipped under the chain, the metal clinking softly like a warning bell. The trail, more a suggestion than a path, wound through dense stands of oak and hickory, leaves carpeting the ground in a brittle layer that crunched under my boots. The air was alive with the sounds of fall, squirrels chattering, wind sighing through branches, the distant call of a crow. I'd spotted deer sign early, a fresh rub on a sapling, droppings scattered like dark pearls, and tracked a buck deeper into the restricted areas, ignoring the occasional rusted fence or warning post half buried in vines. Locals avoided these parts. Stories circulated in the diners about the mine folk, survivors of collapses who'd never been recovered, or runaways who'd hidden in the shafts during hard times. Emerging changed. Dad dismissed them as tall tales to keep kids out of danger, but he'd always carried an extra clip, eyes scanning the shadows. I pushed on, the ground growing uneven, pocked with depressions where earth had subsided over old tunnels. Brambles tugged at my camo pants, and the scent of damp soil mingled with something metallic, like rusted iron seeping from the ground. The forest thickened, sunlight filtering in patches, and an unnatural quiet settled as I neared a derelict entrance. No more animal noises, just my breathing and the soft thud of my steps. The buck's trail led straight toward it, a yawning black mouth in the hillside, framed by crumbling timbers and rubble strewn like forgotten graves. I paused at the edge, rifle slung over my shoulder, scanning for movement. The entrance was partially collapsed, boulders blocking half the opening, but a narrow gap remained, exhaling cool, musty air that carried the faint tang of sulfur and decay. Vines crawled over the debris, nature reclaiming what man had scarred. I'd heard the bucks snort earlier, a challenge echoing from nearby, but now silence reigned, oppressive and thick. I knelt to examine the ground. Hoofprints mingled with something else, irregular impressions in the dirt, like bare feet shuffling through the leaves. Not clean like a hiker's boot, but smeared, toes splayed wide from lack of shoes. My pulse quickened. Poachers? Squatters using the mine for shelter? The area was off limits for good reason. Unstable tunnels, bad air, but desperation drove people to strange places. I shouldered my rifle, chambering around quietly, the click echoing faintly. Curiosity mixed with hunter's instinct. If the buck had bedded down nearby, I wasn't turning back. I edged closer, stepping over rubble, the ground sloping downward into shadow. That's when the footsteps started, not the careful tread of another hunter, but shuffling, irregular gaits, like bodies in used to even ground, emerging from the dark. I froze, heart thudding against my ribs, peering into the gloom. The sounds multiplied, scuffs and drags, accompanied by low grunts that bounced off the stone walls. My eyes adjusted slowly, the dim light from outside revealing shapes amid the rubble. A group of figures, 4 or 5, clambering out from the deeper recesses, their skins ashen from dust and lack of sun, hair wild and streaked with coal residue that clung like black veins. They moved like ghosts of miners past, hunched postures, limbs sinewy from whatever labors they endured below. But they were alive, feral, eyes squinting against the faint daylight filtering in. Clothes hung in tatters, remnants of overalls and shirts pieced with hides and cloths scavenged from God knows where, stained with grime and old blood. They communicated in grunts and gestures, hands waving sharply, heads tilting in unison, like a language forged in isolation. No words, just primal sounds that sent a chill down my spine. One, taller than the others, spotted me first, freezing in place mid-step, its gaze locking on mine. Eyes pale and watery, adapted to perpetual dark, but sharp with awareness. It advanced slowly, hand outstretched, palm up, fingers twisted like roots warped by pressure, nails blackened and chipped from clawing stone. My mouth went dry, mind reeling. These weren't hallucinations from bad air. They were real, breathing remnants of something forgotten. Survivors, perhaps, from the big collapse in '82 that sealed off this branch. Miners presumed dead, but who'd found side tunnels, living on rats and seepage water, warped by years underground, toxins seeping into their blood. Or runaways, families hiding from the law or poverty, generations breeding in the dark until humanity frayed at the edges. The tall one's breath rasped, fogging slightly in the cool air, and its gesture could have been begging for food, for help, or a warning to turn back. The others hovered behind, grunting softly, bodies tense, as if ready to scatter or swarm. I raised my rifle slowly, not aiming but holding it across my chest in warning, finger off the trigger, but ready. "Back off," I whispered, voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. It paused, head cocking, as if understanding the threat, then grunted sharply. The group scattered, retreating into the shadows with those shuffling steps, fading into echoes that reverberated through the shaft like distant thunder. Adrenaline crashed through me. I backed away, rifle still raised, scanning the entrance for any sign of pursuit. The buck was forgotten, the hunt abandoned. I turned and moved quickly down the trail, branches whipping my face, the uneven ground threatening to trip me at every step. My mind raced. Should I report this? To who? Rangers would laugh it off as a tall tale, or worse, investigate and stir up whatever lived down there. The forest seemed alive now, every rustle a potential footstep, every shadow a lurking form. I put miles between me and the mine, descending ridges toward my truck, but the unease clung like cold dust. Stopping to catch my breath at a stream, I noticed something off. Along my back trail, stones piled deliberately at intervals, small cairns, not natural, etched with crude marks like arrows or warnings. A map? Or a trap, guiding others to my path? My stomach nodded. Had they followed unseen, marking my route while I fled? I kicked one over, rocks scattering, but the damage was done. Paranoia set in. I quickened my pace, rifle at the ready, imagining eyes watching from the underbrush. The truck came into view as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the gravel. I threw my gear in the back, started the engine with shaking hands, and peeled out, dust billowing behind. The drive home blurred, highways blending into night, headlights piercing the dark like accusations. That was over a year ago, and I've hung up my gear since, the rifle gathering dust in the closet. The Appalachians call to me in dreams, their hills hiding shafts where echoes linger, footsteps shuffling in eternal dark. Those subterranean survivors, twisted by isolation and poisons, claim the ruins as their domain, emerging only when intruders stray too close. I avoid the woods now, stick to city lights, but in quiet moments, I hear the grunts, feel the outstretched hand brushing mine. What if they're multiplying down there, adapting further? What if one day they surface for good, drawn by the world above? The mountains keep their secrets buried, but sometimes the ground shifts and what's below claws its way out.